Hi, I'm Dr. Jeff Weyers with Zinpro. I'm on the research and nutritional side, primarily in dairy. And the question I'm going to answer today is, what is the proper mix order for your TMR ingredients? And the number one thing that I always recommend to put in first are your dry forages. And within this category, I always include halages or baleage, anything that's inherently difficult to reduce particle size on. I want that going in first. And I want you to give the mixer wagon ample time to do its job to reduce particle size. So a couple things that are really important when we're trying to chop hay with a vertical wagon. Number one is it needs the proper amount of knives and sharpness of knives, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Number two, the mixer wagon has to be on. I like to see a minimum of 18 RPM at the auger. Preferably, I'd like to see around 20 to 23 ideally. And this just allows proper cutting action and mixing action for that mixer wagon, for that hay, to reduce particle size on. The third thing is we need mixing time. We must let the mixer wagon do its job, and we cannot rush through this initial step of particle reduction size on forages. Hugely important. So, some of the main things too, before we start putting more ingredients on with our dry hays, is we want to make sure that bale, whether it's a square bale or a round bale, is thoroughly broken up and it's distributed evenly. There should not be any clumps of hay rolling around in the mixer wagon before we start adding more ingredients. So the next ingredient that I recommend putting in is your higher inclusion rate ingredients. These would be any kind of large premix, your ground corn, for instance, anything that's kind of a rule of thumb, 5 kg and higher. This will go in next, and really what that does is that gives some weight to that forage that's rolling around in there, and that'll actually improve your cutting efficiency with a little bit of weight on top. The next thing I like to see put in is a lactating mineral, or your smaller inclusion ingredients. And the reason I like to put these in the middle is that it gives it enough time to really distribution in the mixer wagon, get mixed up. We probably have a couple other ingredients to put in, but I really like to see that lactating mineral go in somewhere mid-load. After the lactating mineral, this is where I like to put in basically the rest of the dry commodities. If they're not already in a protein mix or a pre-batch or a pre-mix, this is where I like to see byproducts go in. Some smaller inclusion ingredients, 5 kg or less, 4 kg or less. And then that's just a good spot for them. And it really doesn't matter which one you put first in that order. One of the last things that we can put in, and not the very last thing, but if you're not putting liquids on, this is the last thing. But then we come in with our silages. And the silages they also need ample time to mix. So make sure after we put that wet ingredient in, those wet silages, we're giving them time to settle out, distribute, and really start churning in there. The very last ingredient, if this is included in your ration, is any liquids. So I'm talking water, molasses, or whey. And ideally, I'd like to see molasses go in mid-load, but I understand that a lot of times where the molasses distribution isn't always where you're loading the mixer wagon, and the feeder has to get out of the loader, into the tractor, back it up, pull forward, and what have you. And that's just not practical. So I don't mind molasses going in last, but it is very difficult to get a good mix with molasses in a full TMR load unless you let it mix thoroughly after you include that ingredient. So my number one thing here after liquids is treat it like a normal ingredient. After you put water in, let it mix. I would say at the end of a load, a minimum of 3 to 5 minutes. A minimum of 3 to 5 minutes with any liquid you put in at the end. The other thing with liquids is make sure they're going in with a spreader bar. Now, going back to knives, one of the questions that I get all the time is, when do you replace knives? And my answer is always, I don't have a set time. It's very difficult for me to say replace your knives every 6 months. It depends on your ration. It depends on how many knives you're using. It depends on how much feed is going through that mixer wagon and how coarse that feed is. Is there a lot of soil contamination that's going to be wearing down the steel or that edge on that knife? But the rule of thumb is you have to look at your knives, and what I tell everybody is you have to understand what they look like when they're new and what your ration is looking like when you feel like it's not getting chopped enough. Was it the hay? Did I change my mix times? Did I change my RPMs on the auger? Or is it my knives? And when you look at your knives, if they are worn down all the way back to the auger flighting, obviously change them. But a lot of these knives are self-sharpening, and they will stay very sharp right until the very end. But ideally, you'd like that knife to stick out a little bit. It's got an angle on it, and that will improve its cutting efficiency. And there are a couple different kind of knives to use. Some are more swept back, and those are the good cutting blades. But overall, I would like to see when you replace knives, put them on the bottom quarter of your auger. That's where a lot of the cutting action takes place. Now, when you change knives or you rotate knives, you can just continue. If it's not totally worn out, if it still has some substance to it, you can move it up the auger. Now, I would recommend putting the larger non-angled thicker blades, the serrated blades, up on the top of the auger, and this will still help to really churn the feed and throw the feed around as it comes up that auger and helps your mixing action. So knives are very important. The main things with knives are know how many your mixer wagon will hold, know how many you're putting in according to your forage at that time. The thing I always want to make sure of is if your forages change, and let's just say, for instance, you went from a very difficult cutting forage to a brittle hay, don't reduce your mixing time too much or your RPMs. You start pulling knives off the augers to adjust for particle reduction size. If you're getting too much particle reduction, start pull some knives off. Pull 2 knives off the front auger, pull 2 knives off the back auger, and see what that does. Try not to alter your mixing times. So therefore, I hope I answered the question of proper mixing order and when and how to change your knives and really what to look for. But really on the mixing order, it is dairy specific, and your bottom line is you need to get to your proper particle size of that TMR. It needs to be mixed well so the cows are not sorting. Thank you.